Roll call.
Chair Martha A. Flores,
Present.
Member Kelly Carrillo,
Present.
Member Maria Bemis,
Here.
Member John Wallace,
Present.
Member Julia Liu,
Here.
Member Rod Taylor.
Here.
Thank you very much. We will now move into oral communications. This is the opportunity to address the audit committee on any scheduled matter. Unless additional time is authorized by the committee, all commentary shall be limited to 3 minutes per individual and no more than 15 minutes total. Are there any public comments? None here. Do we have any virtual?
No, Your Honor.
We have none. Then we will continue on to the scheduled matters. We will go into the approval of the draft minutes of November the 3rd. I'm sure everybody has had time to look at them, review them. And do we have a motion to approve the minutes of November the 3rd?
I'll make a motion.
We have a motion and a second.
I'll second. Okay.
Okay.
Rob second.
Did somebody second? Okay.
No, you didn't.
Okay.
I get my name on there at least once today.
That's right.
All right. Well, okay. We have a motion. We have a second. No further discussion. All those in favor say aye. Signify by saying aye.
All right.
Aye, aye,
Aye.
Okay. We will now go into the second item, the review and consideration of unfunded pension obligations to continue to review the options to address the city's unfunded pension obligations. Okay.
Well, I suppose I can introduce just as a follow-up, and I know Mr. Levine has a presentation that he'd like to provide, but two takeaways that came from the last meeting was, and is provided in your agenda packet, is the city's general fund reserve ordinance as it relates to, and what I talked about is a potential modification to that ordinance as funds as carryover or is identified how it is distributed into different funds. And so we have a budget stabilization fund, which is 15% of budgeted expenditures, 10% of budgeted expenditures for catastrophic contingency fund. And then we have 3 other reserve funds that we use for as needs arise. And what I suggest is there could be a 4th category or a modification of that to include a pension funding policy. And that's what Mr. Levine provided, which is, I would say, a much stronger policy than what I just discussed, because it's a dedicated policy more broad than the general fund. It's talking about, and again, what I was speaking to is just the general fund. But as we discussed in the last meeting, we have a number of employees that are paid out of different funds, enterprises, water, sewer, wastewater, the streets, airport. I mean, we have a number of funds that support employees. And so there is no overarching policy as it relates to that. So that's where the pension funding policy that the BUD provided kind of speaks more to that, which is talking about as you experience savings, specifically through, even if you don't do a pension obligation bond, how you, by whatever means, by making extra payments, a means of collecting those funds, setting them into a policy dedicated to bring down your unfunded liability. Is that a fair summary, Bud?
Absolutely. And I might want to add to that, the reason we provided a whole separate policy is that it's been our experience, whether you're issuing bonds or just looking at bonds you already have outstanding, the credit agencies, the investing community, they look very favorably on having a separate pension policy for just the reasons you articulated, that it covers so many different aspects of how you go about addressing the issue of unfunded liabilities and having your pension plans funded as much as possible. So that's why there's nothing wrong with adding a section to your already reserved policy, maybe on an overview, and then directing it to the specific pension policy that you would then put into place. You'd have the best of all worlds and do the the best benefit for the city in moving forward, either with a pension obligation bond or just in general in your operations.
So I
Am
think
I-
there's great merit. What I was going to say is there's merit to the policy that was provided as regardless of the pension obligation bond as to how to manage financially the unfunded liability and how funds are set aside to be able to accommodate that. And then the policy speaks even further, and I know in his presentation he'll speak to that, whether it's in a restricted or unrestricted capacity. So and the differentiation between that. Maybe that's a good segue to you, but.
Okay, good. Exactly. And of course, the reason that we've included the pension obligation bond presentation as part of that is that if you're looking at really an overall solution to get that pension policy in place and operating, the issuing pension obligation bonds is a good source of initial funds to create for that purpose. That you can take the savings, and we'll get into that in more detail, but the savings generated can be a great source of funding the other provisions of your pension policy. And that's the way that all fits together. Anecdotally, I might mention along the way, I've had several emails to John over the last 6 months talking about where we thought the bond market was going to go. And I think I've mentioned several times that I thought the 10-year Treasury would trade between around a 140 on the low and a 160 on the high. Anecdotally, November 3rd, when we made our presentation last time, the 10-year was at a 160, and today it's at a 143. So the range of our estimate is on display. Anyway, we're going to continue the discussion on the pension policy. And I think that we've provided that sample policy for you to look at, and I think Rob is going to take you through the presentation. And if you have a copy of that draft pension policy, you can kind of follow along, because a lot of what we're talking about can be seen in the proposed draft policy that we've provided. Also, we have Nikki Tallman here to talk about the market and to talk about the bonds when we discuss that part, and of course to jump in and contribute and answer any questions that come up. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rob to walk through the presentation.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Bud. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Rob Pankratz. For those of you who haven't met me yet, I'll be walking through our presentation on the pension funding policy today. It looks like screen sharing is enabled, so I'm going to go ahead and share the screen with the presentation on it. Can everyone see my presentation on your screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we'll just jump right into it. Just a quick high-level overview of the things we're going to talk about in this presentation, and many of the key topics contained within the policy is a overview of the pension funding policy, sort of a refresh and a background on the different CalPERS costs that we talked about earlier this month. And then we'll move on to specific components of the policy, which include required contributions, target funding levels, pension trust reserves, pension obligation bonds or POBs, the set aside of pension-related savings, the funding of new unfunded liabilities post the issuance of pension obligation bonds, superfunding status, and transparency measures. And then we will talk about next steps and sort of transition back to talking about a specific pension obligation bond issuance. Each of these sections is about 2 slides long. So at the end of each of these sections, I'll pause for questions and any comments by the board. And then of course, we'll open it up for more questions at the end. So jumping right into the first section, an overview of a pension funding policy. A pension funding policy is a helpful tool for cities and other agencies in managing their ever-changing pension liabilities. Pension liabilities can cause financial stress and redirect precious resources away from programs necessary for the city's operations and services to the public. The city seeks to address its largest liability, its CalPERS unfunded accrued liability, or UAL, in the most cost-efficient manner possible. A pension funding policy provides guidance for decision makers at the staff and council level and sets expectations for the investment community and the public. Pension funding policy overview continued. The basic thesis of this pension funding policy is to issue low interest rate bonds to fund additional discretionary payments. I'll use this term a lot, ADPs, additional discretionary payments. And these are payments made to CalPERS outside of your normal cost CalPERS payment and your minimum UAL contribution for the year. So backing up just a little bit, the thesis of this policy is to issue low interest rate bonds to fund ADPs towards CalPERS plans that have unfunded liabilities for the purpose of fully funding or nearly fully funding the plans, specifically the legacy plans and the classic plans. Once pension plans are fully funded or close to fully funded, the policy outlines the various tools and strategies that will help the city keep its plans fully funded as it goes into the future. Sort of an important disclosure that Bud sort of addressed earlier already is without the influx of funds from the pension obligation bonds, the effectiveness of the tools and strategies that we're going to outline in this presentation today are pretty significantly diminished. Now, they are still effective tools and strategies, but that influx of funds is really what really allows the city to change its course as far as how it deals with its pension liabilities, and really allows it to accelerate the process of recharting that course. So last bullet point on this slide, without fully funded plans, these mitigating strategies must overcome the obstacle of the 6.8% interest charge on UALs just to break even. That's why most of these strategies sort of key off of raising new funds for bonds, because without bringing that UAL to a fully funded place or to zero or approaching zero, if you're still paying that 6.8% interest on a large portion of the overall value of your pension plans, it's a tough obstacle to overcome.
Rob, I might want to jump in here for a sec. We noticed we're using the 6.8 interest. When we were here November 3rd, we knew that CalPERS was going to be lowering their rate, which up to through this last year was 7%. They hadn't made the final decision whether they were going to be lowering it to 6.8. There was some discussion they would lower it to 6.5. This was all caused by the 21% positive performance by their investment policy for this fiscal year ending June 30th, 2021. We now have determined, and they have issued a statement that the new rate going forward will be 6.8%.
Thank you, Bud. Before I jump into the next section, any pressing questions? Seeing none, I'll move to background on CalPERS costs. So this is really sort of a refresh of some of the stuff we talked about at the November 3rd meeting. But to summarize, CalPERS payments are broken up into two different payments that the city makes each year. First is the normal cost payment. The normal cost payment represents the cost of pension benefits earned by current employees in the current fiscal year. And normal cost payments are paid as a percentage of payroll. The normal cost component is typically fully funded on an annual basis. When CalPERS lowers its discount rate to 6.8%, that percentage of the payroll for your normal cost payment will increase. And then your UAL payment will decrease because you're paying a lower interest rate. And that's how CalPERS makes both sides of the equation balance, because what's owed to retirees doesn't change when CalPERS lowers its discount rate. Just the makeup of where those benefits come from changes. And since they're only targeting to earn 6.8% instead of 7 or 7.5 going forward, that difference in investment earnings is made up on the normal cost side of the equation. So UAL costs represent the unfunded benefits earned for employees' prior year's service, and funding levels change periodically due to investment performance, employee and retiree events, benefit levels, and actuarial assumptions. UAL payments are a fixed dollar amount that is adjusted annually by CalPERS based on the above listed variables. A little bit more on sort of background on what we covered earlier this month. Every June 30th, CalPERS completes a new actuarial valuation report for every plan of all member employees, and they calculate each employer's pension liability as of the new annual valuation date. If the value of the funded assets are not equivalent to the new liability amount, the city will incur a new UAL. That's how new UALs are created. The UAL may increase or decrease in subsequent years due to any and all of the following factors: changes in actuarial assumptions and demographics, including the discount rate, the employee mix, etc., changes in actuarial and gains and losses due to overperformance or underperformance, changes in plan benefits offered by the employer, and changes in the number of participating employees or the employee pickup of plan contributions. Any questions on the background section? If not, I'll jump right into the first policy component of the pension funding policy. Okay, so the first policy component of the pension funding policy that you have in front of you is required contributions, and to set expectations with respect to those annual contributions. It's recommended that CalPERS participants make all actuarial determined contributions each year as prescribed by their plan actuary in their actuarial valuation report. And this includes the normal cost payment component as well as the minimum UAL payment component. Required contributions are the first item that should be reviewed annually when managing your pension liabilities. The next component of the pension policy is the funding level. The second key component is setting a target funding level for each plan at CalPERS. Having a target funding level assists in making decisions with respect to ADPs or extra payments towards the UAL, and it helps manage the plans from year to year. The city's first tier classic plans, its largest plans, the miscellaneous and safety plans, are currently funded at 65% and 73% respectively. And the other various plans, including the PEPRA and the tier 2 plans, all have funded ratios of hovering right at 89 to 90%. When all the plans are combined, all the assets for the various plans are combined, the total funding level is currently at 69%, and that's because the amount of the classic plans is so much greater than of the new PEPRA plans and the second tier plans. It's recommended that plans be close to fully funded each year to avoid CalPERS interest charges. The most conservative agencies that we've worked with in making ADPs have targeted funding levels of up to 100%. Fully funded or super funded plans, which have a UAL of 0, or in the case of super funded plans, a negative UAL, are not charged interest by CalPERS at the 6.8% return, which is the main component that we're trying to eliminate here. Within the pension funding policy that's in front of you, there's an option to set a target level and a level that the city is willing to commit to. Now, it's not required or necessary to differentiate between those two. It's really a decision of the city, but we think it's a nice component as you can set a goal and a target that you're going to try to work towards over time, but you can also commit to a minimum level and sort of use that as a benchmark going forward.
You might want to point out here that, and I know Rob's going to get into that a little bit later about superfunded, but the easy one is to say you're going to fund it 100%. The only reason that should be even up for discussion is in years in which you're fully funded, and if CalPERS overperforms, you end up having an excess that sits there, and it acts as almost a reserve for future unfundeds that may be created. But in the meantime, it's money that's there that does not earn any interest. So that's why some entities, issuers, or cities or districts decide to fund something a little less than 100%. So they have that ability to have that excess. And that's something that should be discussed by the committee and by the council as to what level makes the most sense for the city of Porterville.
Right. And just to clarify one comment, the super funded plans or the money that's sitting there with the negative UAL balance, it is invested by CalPERS. So it's not sitting there idle, but but CalPERS isn't paying you interest specifically for being overfunded, sort of in a reverse way to how they charge you interest when you're underfunded. So we just want to clarify that.
So that's good, Rob.
Moving to slide 8, target
Can I
funding
ask
level.
a follow-up question to Bud on that? So I understand that concept. What as a factor of the?
You know, that's a real question, John, because this is very relevant because we know going forward, you know, CalPERS is always a year or so behind in their calculation of how it affects your unfunded and your payments. We know for a fact that the fiscal year ending June of 2021, they had a 21% performance. So that's going to produce, if we were to do the bonds if we were to go ahead and do bonds to pay off your unfunded, we want to be very careful in doing the calculation of what you actually issue, knowing that there's going to be some adjustment of the unfunded liabilities down. So we would probably only issue somewhere, we haven't, you know, this will be up for discussion and we'll get verification from CalPERS before we would move that far along, but it would be somewhere around maybe an 80 or 85%. Normally, I think a good number, if you're not doing 100%, would be somewhere around 95%. But if you know going in that there's a very big year, which are outliers, then you would adjust the bond so you don't start out right away with a big superfunded excess.
And if I could just clarify that a little bit more, when he's saying fund 80%, he's meaning funding 80% of what your current UAL balance according to your latest actuarial report that has not yet taken into consideration the huge earnings year last year and the reduction of the discount rate. If we move forward, when we talk to CalPERS, they will be able to give us an updated balance as of the end of this current fiscal year, June 30th of 2022, at which point the city would have the opportunity to make a decision as to whether it wanted to fund 100% of what that balance is projected to be by the end of this year, or a lesser amount such as 95 or 95, 98%, et cetera. And since we're on this topic right now, I think it makes sense to just quickly jump ahead to slide 16, where we talk about super funding, because there's really two different options and two different outlooks on how to look at this. And we've had different clients view it both of these two ways. So when you're deciding to fund either 100% or 95%, what you're looking at is how you want to treat those excess funds that are in your CalPERS plans, because you can't withdraw them for any reason. So we've had some clients that like to fund 100%, knowing that if CalPERS earns 6.9% the next year and exceeds their benchmark, their UAL plan will be super funded. And they're okay with that because they are going to treat that as a reserve. It is invested by CalPERS, even though, as we said earlier, it's not gaining extra interest for being overfunded. And it's used as really the most restricted reserve fund to fund your pension liabilities. Now, you can't use it for other sorts of pension liabilities, such as OPEBs or other costs, but it's a very strong, very restricted reserve. And some conservative cities that we've worked with look at that favorably. Other cities that we've worked with do not want to achieve a superfunded status because having excess money with CalPERS is taking away cash from the city that could otherwise be put to a different use. It could be in an unrestricted reserve trust, or it could be used to support city programs and services. So that's really a policy decision that would be made by the city.
Councilmember Carrillo, did you have a question backtracking to anything that has already been discussed?
I thought I did, but I think we're heading in the direction
Okay,
that's helping.
all right, I just wanted to make sure.
And this is kind of just in my experience. So in my school district days, and Maria, I don't know if the city was in this position or not, but before the benefit enhancements of the early 2000s, PERS was fully funded. They talked about that percentage of payroll. The employers didn't have a payroll cost. The employees did. There's a statutory amount, but it shows you what happened in 20 years.
Yeah.
Is that 2 decades ago, the city of Porterville didn't have an employer cost because it was fully funded, or whatever needed to be funded was being funded by the employee. And then there were benefit enhancements that were put in place retroactively. First year of service. So you could have been a 20-year employee of the city of Porterville. Instead of that benefit taking effect for the year that it was made in 2001, it was retroactive back for all of the years because it was super funded. And so they enacted enhanced benefits and it turned it upside down. And then it was and then you had the dot-com bubble burst, which they lost money and they enhanced benefits. And we went from superfunded, as this is described, we were superfunded, to significantly underfunded. Those are the two primary reasons how we got here. So superfunding isn't about, I said this before, this is the politics of it, because there could be, if you're sitting and you've got $1 million over your pension obligation sitting with PERS, that's $1 million you don't have for other city services or programs.
Another, and we talk about this a little bit later too, unless you want to talk about it now, Rob, is that the super funding sometimes causes issues with your employees where they see you're super funded and they just, almost as you just described what happened at the school district, they want more benefits.
They were negotiating for, they said, you're not paying your share of PERS, you owe us a raise.
Exactly. So
School districts, I'm retired school district, so.
when,
I'm retired school district, been there, done that, and seen some things.
gotcha. Good.
Well, my comment to that is that employees should want it to be, the way this game ends, if it does, is that you only get what is funded. So whatever you think your formula is, so as an example, they use, what is it? What's the miscellaneous? 60 some percent?
65.
65. Yeah. So if you're planning on $100,000 a year in your pension, it's actually 65,000 because that's all you're going to get, because that's all it's funded at.
And the other side of the super funding, to answer the other question that came up, is if they were consistently outperforming their benchmark, you wouldn't be sitting there with 58 million in unfunded liabilities over the years. So that just tells you that doesn't occur that often where they're outperforming to that extent.
Exactly.
Great.
And John, you're absolutely right. Of the two components that really got us where we are today, and kind of the third lesser component was the Great Recession in 2008. So those three just compounded the problem, so that most entities are like you, about 65 or 70, 72% funded.
Yeah, that's a good point. There was massive, I don't even think the state employee count has reached what it was before the recession. And as you talk about that, so when you reduce employees, because it's a rate of payroll, if you reduce the number of employees paying, then you're actually short-cheating yourself again, because you're not putting enough resources into that. So good point.
So to just sort of close the loop on super funding, we recommend that the city put in the pension funding policy how it would view super funding if it got to that status. What we've seen other cities do is write in their policy that they will view super funding similarly to other pension reserve trusts, whether it was super funded by design or super funded over time due to overperformance, and that any super funding should not be used as a contribution holiday or to grant new benefits, and should just be maintained to protect against future unforeseen economic events or financial downturns. So jumping, I think we tied up target funding level. The last bullet point here to cover is that the target funding level, and whether it's the target level or the commit level, it can be adjusted or amended anytime by the council simply by amending the pension funding policy, as well as all of the components of the pension funding policy can be modified by council at any time. Pension consideration of the pension funding policy, which is to determine what reserve programs make the most sense for the city. Once CalPERS plans have achieved the target funding level, pension trust reserves should be utilized to maintain that level over time due to subsequent years to avoid any interest charges by CalPERS. Certain pension trust reserves allow the city to invest in asset classes that are less conservative and more aggressive than what would typically be appropriate for general fund reserves and would out-earn funds like LAIF that the city could invest its general reserves in. Pension trust reserves are designed to provide funds that are used to make unfunded accrued liability payments and additional discretionary payments to CalPERS to bring plans to the target funding level after underperformance by CalPERS in any given year. Paying off the UAL as it accrues avoids the CalPERS interest charge of 6.8% on all unfunded plan liabilities. Pension trusts are generally divided into two different categories: restricted and unrestricted reserves. The Section 115 trust is probably the most popular restricted reserve that we see for California agencies. And that's typically managed by a third-party provider, whereas pension rate stabilization reserves are typically treated more similarly to other city reserves that are managed by the city. We're going to go into a little more depth on each of these on the next two slides. So for the Section 115 trust, it's the most popular restricted trust for California agencies. Funds deposited in a Section 115 cannot be reallocated to the general fund or expended for purposes other than pension-related costs and expenses, whether that's the normal cost payment, a UAL payment, ADPs to reduce the UAL, or OPEB liabilities that are outside of the CalPERS system entirely. Section 115 trusts are managed by third-party providers. PARS is the most common provider of the plans that we see, but this is not an endorsement of them over any other provider. There's various providers and plans available, and of course, the city is free to choose the provider and the plan that best fits its needs. The purpose of Section 115 is to gradually build up a positive balance by setting aside all or a portion of pension-related savings from ADPs or other available monies to offset future UALs. Pension rate stabilization reserves. Pension rate stabilization reserve is a general reserve that's intended to be used towards those same pension-related costs, the normal costs, UALs, ADPs, and OPEB liabilities. These funds are typically unrestricted. Now, they can be restricted, but when they're restricted at the city level, as I'm sure you all know, they can be reallocated council or the future council. So it's just not as ironclad as a 115 trust, but it does provide a lot of added flexibility if that's seen as a benefit in this situation. They're typically managed in-house, similarly to other reserves. And just like a 115, the goal is to gradually build up a balance in your stabilization reserve by setting aside a portion of pension-related savings or from other available funds. Any questions on the reserve sections?
I have a little point or a question, John. In your reserve policy, your special purposes reserve fund, is that one that could be modified to almost act in part as a pension rate stabilization reserve?
That is that the $100,000 one you're
Yes,
referring to?
yes.
That was, so that is an annual appropriation to the council for purposes that they see fit, generally for one-time, a one-time expenditure. So if they want to send a team to a sister city and there's a $25,000 expense associated with that, that was set as a special purposes reserve. What I was proposing is as it actually kind of how to intertwine, and it's only specific to the general fund, which is to have as a budget is established and you know what expenditure you would be looking at is to have it either as a percentage of whatever the budget expenditures are, similar to how the other funds are, or as a carryover, assuming that the budget stabilization fund and the catastrophic fund are both fully funded, which is 25% of budgeted expenditures.
Right.
If there's funding, if there is carryover, assuring that, because those should be funded to begin with. And we actually have funds in those other three accounts. That if there is carryover, and again, that becomes during COVID, that was, not, but it would, you essentially be splitting that into different funds. And this gets really to the core of the conversation in the general fund, at least, because we do have Measure I, which is a general fund revenue. It is a dedicated revenue, but it is a revenue of the general fund, which one of its core elements was ensuring public safety. And that was wanting to ensure, and this really gets back to the as the costs of employees go up, I guess, as I would say, because this is to what extent are you contributing towards that with those funds?
Okay, so you could either set up a separate rate stabilization reserve as part of your reserve policy,
Correct.
or you could link it in some way to excess than the others to be transferred in, something like that. That would certainly work.
Right.
Go ahead, Rob.
All right, moving on to our next section, pension obligation bonds. This is as it relates to the pension funding policy, not as it would relate to potential 2022 bonds. And really the purpose of this is to take into consideration a lot of the negative guidance that's been put out there surrounding POBs, such as the guidance that was given out by the GFOA. And really what this is meant to do is to put in the policy all of the restrictions that the city would have if it were to issue pension obligation bonds, to make sure that it's utilizing them in an appropriate and in an efficient way. So just to walk through a couple of these bullet points, and of course more could be added if there were more restrictions that anyone at the city saw prudent. But just to walk through these quickly, POBs should be viewed as a tool that can be used from time to time to make ADPs to avoid CalPERS interest charges in a manner that preserves the city's cash and allows for the maintaining of healthy fund balances and reserve levels. POBs should not be structured to defer payments or to extend the term of any CalPERS payback schedule. POBs should be structured with optional redemption provisions or optional prepayment provisions to provide the city with flexibility down the road in managing its pension obligations, as we know that these things can change quite quickly. POBs should not finance CalPERS normal cost payments. POB proceeds should only be used to fund unfunded pension costs and financing charges associated with issuing the POBs. POBs should not bear an interest rate that makes the financing inconsistent with the city's debt management policy, and the interest rate should be a fixed rate with a true interest cost that is some amount of basis points below the CalPERS target rate of return. I use 200 basis points as an example here, or 2%, but we've seen cities set that threshold higher or lower. But but the purpose of this is to make sure that you have a very high likelihood that the pension obligation bonds out earn, or that the CalPERS out earns the true interest cost of the pension obligation bonds over the time horizon of the bonds, whether it's 20 years, 25 years, etc. POBs should not use derivatives, swaps, or other complex financial instruments, and POBs should always be approved at a public hearing of the City Council. On slide 13, we talk a little bit about judicial validation with respect to the POBs. We covered at the last committee meeting the two available structures for POBs: the lease structure, which requires collateral, and the judicial validation structure. And we always think it's the best, not always, but for the case of the city of Porterville, we think the best road to go down is certainly the judicial validation route to preserve your assets for other projects. So just to expand on that a little bit, the city should complete a judicial validation with an uncapped or unlimited authorization amount, meaning that if you were to go issue future POBs down the road, you would not have to repeat this process and bear that expense again. Although if you were to issue POBs down the road, they would still need to be approved by the City Council and go through all the other formal steps and procedures that are required. Judicial validation typically takes between 60 and 120 days after approval by the council, depending on the level of cooperation from the county's superior court system. We know that there's been at least one other POB issuer that took the judicial validation route in Tulare County. So we would hope that they would be able to fall in that 60 to 120 day window. Utilizing judicial validation when issuing POBs enables the city to issue bonds without having to put up collateral, which would otherwise be required in an amount greater than or equal to the par amount of the bonds. So in this case, over $50 million of collateral would be needed to utilize a lease structure, which is obviously an inefficient use of city assets that should be reserved for other priority projects, either now or in the future.
I have some streets for you, Rob.
By the way, I was just going to mention, John, there's very little collateral left, I think. It was almost an academic exercise to talk about that. However, the interesting thing is, you remember years ago, we did streets for you in a deal. And then when we tried to refund, the market was not accepting streets. Well, guess what? Right. The market now is accepting streets. So if you ever got a situation where you needed to do a COP for some specific project without the available capital, you could use the streets.
Right. Okay, good to know. Yeah, question on the other agent. Was that the county? And how long did it take?
I'm not sure how long it took, but we could.
Maybe Nikki knows. Do you remember that at all?
I don't remember how long it took.
But was that the county of Tulare when they did that?
It was.
Okay.
Yeah. It was.
Yeah.
Yeah. The amount of time these proceedings are taking has varied. And of course, as a result of COVID and the shutdown, we went through a period, we did quite a few of these over the last couple of years. And we had a period where it really took a long time, that because the courts were so crowded, because they were off for a long period of time, and then there was a lot of catch up. I think now things have smoothed out a lot. And so it probably would be more towards the shorter end of the estimated time. However, it's kind of the luck of the draw on what kind of judge you get, whether they're one that's going to move pretty quickly or one that's going to just let stuff sit on their desk for a while.
Right.
And I think I would just add with the validation, it is not, it doesn't mean you have to issue POBs. It just starts the process in the event that decide to issue POBs. So I know that the bond council that the city works with does not charge for the validation work. And it's just a matter of going through the process. Once you get the validation, again, you don't have to issue the POBs, and the validation, I don't think it expires. It certainly doesn't expire within a 5 or 10 year period.
Yeah, it doesn't. Correct. It does. That's right, Nikki. Also, the normal situation to do, even if you're not totally sure you want to issue the bonds, is to go ahead and authorize the bonds you then have you have to have a document that is approved in the validation, and it's usually trust agreement. So you have the trust agreement, you go to the courts and file the validation suit, you get the judgment, and then we come back to the council for approval of the actual issuing documents, the POS and other documents. And that's a second opportunity for the council then to approve actually moving forward with the issue. And if you don't move forward with the issue, you do have the validation in place. So if at some future time you want to move forward, you already have it in place to just do that second step instead of having to go through the whole process again.
Thanks, Bud. Moving on to the next section, set aside of pension related savings. In our last presentation, we had conservatively estimated that the city could potentially reduce its annual payment towards its UAL by about $850,000 a year for the next 22 years via the issuance of pension obligation bonds that would fund ADPs in the city's safety and miscellaneous plans. The pension funding policy should set a target for the set aside amount of the savings, and we typically see that as a percentage of the annual reduction in UAL expenses. And you can put together an easy formula to calculate that or change it on an annual basis. For example, we've seen some of our clients put 50% of their annual savings from pension obligation bonds to be set aside in a restricted 115 trust, and for the other half to be set aside in an unrestricted reserve, such as a stabilization account. This set aside provision would provide the city with available funds to make future ADPs after the issuance of bonds if CalPERS underperforms in the future, without having to issue a second POB. Funding of new UALs post ADPs. The city should set a target timeline for meeting its target funding level in subsequent years after issuing a POB to avoid unnecessary interest charges and to avoid that UAL building up quickly over time. CalPERS annually charges their 6.8% interest rate on all outstanding balances of participating employers, and conservative agencies that we've assisted with ADPs have set a target of paying off any newly created UALs after a POB of about 2 years from the date that they receive notice via their actuarial valuation report that a new UAL has been created. So what that 2 years does is it gives CalPERS 1 year to sort of try to offset that on their own by overperforming. But if they don't overperform and there's 2 years of underperformance in a row, that typically is a good time frame to use some of the money in a section 115 or in an unrestricted reserve to bring that UAL back to zero and your funding levels back to 100% or 98% or whatever level is decided on for the proposal. I think we addressed all the super funding stuff already, so I'll skip this slide. And then the last slide with respect to the pension funding policy is transparency measures. The policy is a great tool to demonstrate transparency to the public and also to other agencies with respect to pension liabilities. In the policy, the city can commit to various transparency measures, which typically involve regular posting on the website of the information that I've listed on this slide, which is copies of the annual actuarial valuation report, your audited financial statements, which I'm sure you already post, that include specifically information on the annual contributions made and the funded ratios of each plan, annual budgets that include expected contributions to CalPERS each year, and annual fund balances on pension trust accounts, such as a 115 or an unrestricted reserve. We find these really helpful, not just for the public, but also for other agencies in your area. One thing that can be really difficult to compare is your pension situation to your neighbor's pension situation, because you can look at the actuarial valuation reports and look at the funding levels, but it really tells an incomplete story if you're trying to compare it to another agency, because that agency may have a 115 and pension reserve trusts. They're building up to fund CalPERS at the appropriate time, or they may have issued a POB or made an additional discretionary payment within the last 2 years that hasn't yet showed up on their CalPERS report. So providing more information to neighboring agencies and communities and to the public really just bolsters the transparency, and over time will improve the perception of how local pensions are handled.
Is there a city that you kind of use as a model for that?
There's the city that we recently instituted this with was San Anselmo. I don't know if they've gotten up to speed in regards to following these transparency measures yet. They just closed on their bond in September, but I'm sure there are other agencies I could point you towards that have a dedicated portion of their site to transparency revolving pension related financials. And on the next slide, I'm going to kick it over to Bud to talk about potential next steps.
Rob, you're doing a great job. Why don't you just continue on with this?
Okay, great. So the first next step that we see is to continue to work with staff and the audit committee to finalize a pension funding policy for the city over the month of December to present to council in January of 2022. When we present the policy to council in 2022, we would imagine including a resolution that would approve the documents and the process required to begin the judicial validation proceedings. The resolution will enable the city to commence the procedure required to issue the POBs, though the actual sale of bonds, as Bud mentioned earlier, would be dependent on a second approval by council at a later date. The third next step we have is to after the judicial validation process begins, to come back to the audit committee and to work with staff to finalize a structure for the POBs that best needs the needs and city, the needs and goals of the city. And we envision that process happening in the end of January of 2022 and throughout February of 2022, while we wait for the final approvals on the validation cycle to go through their appeal processes. And then finally, in March of 2022, we would present the final bond structure to the council for approval, which would include a resolution that approves the selling document known as the preliminary official statement, the rest of the financing documents, as well as authorizing the issuance and sale of the bonds, at which point we would enter the market, have the bond pricing, have a closing, and go through all the other steps we've gone through on the city's previous bond issuances.
Might want to add in that item 3, working with staff and audit committee to finalize the structure. That's the point at which we would get into dialogue with the actuary for CalPERS to determine what the balance is anticipated to be of the unfunded for when we would think we would be scheduling a close of the transaction, and thereby we can be closer to where the actual unfunded liability is when we do the bonds.
Are there any questions on the next step slide before we jump sort of back to some of the concepts from the November 3rd presentation, specifically relating to the POB projections?
I don't have a question, but I'd like to comment. First of all, I want to say thank you for the information that you have provided us and going back with what some of the things that we did discuss at the last meeting. As you were speaking with the presentation, I was following it on the draft policy that was attached to our document, trying to see what was going where with what. And there's a lot of work that has to be done as far as the wording of what's going to go into the policy and go with that. So I want to thank you for that, because I was following it through, kind of using it as a tool to see what we would have to look at to work with staff who would have to help us with all of this. But I want to say thank you. Councilman Krill, did you have anything?
I think I do have one question, and going back to the pension trust reserves, the section 115 versus the stabilization. So I was just trying to determine, so one's restricted, one's unrestricted. What would be the purpose of utilizing the section 115 that's restricted?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's absolutely the discussion that goes on in every city council we've worked with when they've considered doing a 115 trust. And there's usually two arguments for either side of using or not using. The position of using the 115 trust is the fact that the money cannot, once it's put in, it's locked in there for use only for pension obligations. Now that takes away the flexibility for some cities if they ended up in a situation where they really needed some money for some very serious situation, and that was one source of funds. They're not going to be able to access those funds for that purpose. So that would be the argument against using it, is that it loses flexibility. The argument for keeping it in there is so that a frivolous activity that might come up with a future council, where somebody has an idea of doing some kind of exploratory development, and they don't have the money for it in the normal course of the city's funds. Oh, well, let's tap the 115. We're not going to need it because everything's going okay with CalPERS, and there's no need for this excess money. So the councils that are concerned about future councils using it improperly or frivolously, that gives them comfort in doing that. So those are
sides of the same coin.
That's right.
Kind of speaks to, as you talk about, it's not uncommon to see 50%. So when you have so these are, we'll take a lot of budgetary consideration, because what you're talking about doing is these are monies you're not paying now, but you can look in the future what you're going to have to pay. And if you issue this, there's that savings, but it's unrealized. So these funds that you would be paying, you set into, and then how do you do that? And assuming, and depending on the performance of PERS, that's why there was that conversation about 50%. And it's kind of a way to kind of Solomon split the baby, right? So half of it's going to be here. You can't touch it for other than the express purpose that it's set in there. And then you have this other one, which is a stabilization, which just generally means that it can be moved, with the finding of the council. The city's own general fund budget stabilization is a good example of that. 4/5 vote of the council moves money out of that account for whatever purpose it finds.
The good news is you can't touch it. The bad news is you can't touch it.
Exactly.
They have two. That's why they have two, which
right.
is just to have this other one over here, which I don't. Yeah, that gets to what Bud's question was about the special purposes fund and having something set up that would have a certain amount in it that you're just going to dedicate every year to go towards your UAL.
Thank you.
Do we want to go through? Well, go ahead, Rob. Would you want to walk them through the previous?
Yeah, I guess I could just pull the audience quickly. We had sort of picked out some of the select slides that we thought from the previous presentation were the most relevant that we could maybe reference to answer questions. We were going to specifically go over the projections again. Just taking a quick poll of the room, would you like us to walk through all of these slides that we presented on November 3rd? Not all of the slides from the 3rd, but all the slides that are appended to this presentation. There's about 7 or 8 of them. Or we could just talk about the financial projections.
What would you like to do? Do you want to each one? These were presented at the last meeting.
I'm comfortable with just the financial projections if everybody else is. But I don't know, but that's just my
Girl wasn't here, so that's really what her.
I did watch the YouTube, and so I'm not an expert, definitely, but I think we're okay with going over the financials.
Okay.
All right, great. So
Questions
So
regardless.
this is a good example of what we're,
Right.
this is a graphic discussion of it.
right, and I know we talked about this at our last meeting, but and John just mentioned this a couple minutes ago. It's important to remember that these savings are unrealized, and that the column on the left-hand side of our table in the middle of this slide, the projected UAL amortization schedule, that is a constantly moving target by CalPERS. So it's not like looking at a refunding of a general obligation bond or a revenue bond for one of the enterprise funds, because you're comparing a variable rate schedule on the left-hand side to what will be a fixed rate payment schedule in the center column. Now, this is CalPERS' best estimate of what your payments will look like going forward as of their last actuarial valuation date, but it is always a moving target, and it's important that that's understood, and that when you're looking at these savings, you don't say, oh, we're saving $19 million, let's figure out how we're going to spend that money right away, because not all of that cash is actually necessarily going to show up in your general fund by your reduction in payments. It could be more, it could be less. So with that being said, here we're showing potential cash flow savings projections for a 22-year POB. This is compared to your current payment schedule of 24 years, so it would be a 2-year reduction in the term. Your current amortization schedule with CalPERS, it sort of has a bell-shaped curve where the payments increase for the first few years, stay relatively towards the top of that curve, and then tail off in the last few years of the schedule. We have, for this projection, structured the debt service on the POBs to mimic that bell curve. That's one of many options that are available. It could be structured with level payments. It could be structured in a variety of different ways. But this projection shows about $850,000 annually in reduced payments towards the city's UAL, which would total $19 million over those 24 years. The net present value of this reduction in payments is about $13 million. So still quite high and quite strong. It's not all backloaded to say. On the right-hand side, we show a potential sources and uses of funds chart. It's a single source of funds, just the par amount of bonds issued, which in this case would be about $53 million, although we know that number will be let me go through the uses first, and then I'll say what I'm going to say. We have a couple different uses. First, the payoff of the UALs for the safety and miscellaneous plan in the approximate amount here of $52 million, as well as cost of issuance of about $600,000, which would include consultants, attorneys, the underwriter, trustees, everybody that's involved in a bond issue. Add those two figures together with the rounding proceeds, and we match our total sources of funds. We do know that the payoff amounts of the UAL plans will be reduced from what is shown on this table due to the assumption changes and CalPERS' spectacular earnings last year of 23%. Once we get further along in this process, we'll be contacting your plan actuary at CalPERS to get a more realistic update about what this number will look like at the end of the current fiscal year, after they've taken into account as many of those assumption changes that they can in their current cycle. So we try to be really conservative here, knowing that number is going to change. And hopefully we'd have better projections at that lower amount after we're able to talk to the plan actually.
Rob, I think we already lowered the amount. The amount that came from the last official CalPERS report, I believe, showed 58 million. We
Correct.
lowered 53 million. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and we also, as Rob pointed out, in being conservative, we used a much higher rate of interest. We used a buffer of around 25 or 30 basis points. You combine that with the fact that the interest rates as of today have dropped 25, 30 basis points from when we did this. we've got a pretty good conservative buffer, which will protect our estimate of savings, even if the total amount of unfunded goes down further. So I think it's a reasonable representation of what can be expected. But as we pointed out, before we come back with a real proposal to be accepted by the council, we will have verified and bring up to date what the CalPERS is showing as their estimate of including with the 21% performance from 2021.
And just to reiterate something I said at the beginning of the presentation that I think is worth repeating, as we know, the UAL amount will go down when the next actuarial valuation report is released due to these assumption changes. But the amount of benefits that are owed to retirees is not going to change just based on moving of the discount rate. So if CalPERS is now projecting to achieve lower investment returns than what it had previously forecasted, the normal cost payment component is going to go up next year and in the years to follow, even if the UAL payments reduced. It's just another great argument to set aside these potential savings in different reserve trust accounts to combat not only the UAL, but the rising normal costs that are going to be realized over the next few years.
So I think that's our presentation at this point, and we seek guidance from where you would like to go next. If you would like, we could come back to the City Council with or work further with this committee to finalize a pension funding policy, and then come back to the City Council with both an approval for the policy, and if you decide you want to move forward with the first step in issuing a pension obligation bond by authorizing the validation and approving the initial documents.
And of course, the pension funding policy and the commencement of proceedings leading to a judicial validation would be two separate resolutions, two separate items.
Correct. Yes, that is correct.
Last meeting, we concluded that we would be working with a policy, and that was part of the process to move into the next direction that we needed to. So what is it the committee would like to see where it is that we go? Because the policy was what we concluded the meeting with.
Well, I know I did review the draft that was included with the information, and I think it's a good. I mean, I don't really see a downside to adopting a policy. Obviously, whether or not we end up pursuing the bonds will dictate whether or not we include that portion of that information that's in the policy. So, and honestly, you know, I'm the lawyer. I'm going to defer to our finance director and our city manager for recommendations on whether they think this is a good idea. I'm not necessarily opposed to it, and I honestly think it's ultimately a council decision anyways. So, but those are just my thoughts, and I apologize. I'm jumping in because I'm going to have to jump out of the meeting pretty soon. So, but I've got mixed feelings about bonding, but I understand, you know, the benefits of doing it. So,
and I'm going to ask this question because I know that Rob Taylor represents the city, the at large, the community, and I wanted to know what his feelings or take or comments are to everything that we're doing here.
You know, my questions and comments lead more towards just the political side of things, how it looks to the public. John mentioned something about that last time. You do a bond and that money's sitting there, and you guys have already talked about the good and bad of that. The perception from those that tend to attend council meetings, and the questions that will come up. You know, that's going to probably happen. And how do you prepare for that? I don't know if you can. This is pretty complicated stuff. So sitting through 2 hours plus of this already, I can't imagine how you could ever truly explain it to somebody in a short period of time to make them understand, the decisions that you're going to make and how the heck, this whole thing works. So I think that's it, from just a civilian's point of view. I put myself at the meeting, sitting in the audience, listening to the council discuss all this, and it's a bit overwhelming. I don't know how the council can, I don't know how you two can even explain this to your other council members.
We have done this for many different cities, and I think we keep our explanation. I mean, here with your committee, we go into the weeds. We go into as deep as we can go, but for purposes of presenting this, we try to keep it in a way that is the basic concept to understand that right now you have an unfunded liability in excess of 50 million, which means you don't have enough money in your account to, if this continues, to ultimately have enough money to pay all of your pension obligations when your employees retire. And here's a way to bring that back to where it is now fully funded. And by doing it, you're going to be paying far less in yearly payments to CalPERS than you are if you don't do anything.
Oh, agreed. And when you put it that way, Bud, it makes sense. And I got to say, I'm all for the bond. It looks good on paper to me, and I like what was it, the 115, the 115 or whatever.
115 trust, absolutely.
Yeah, trust. You're right. The good part is you can't touch it, and the bad part is you can't. But
yeah.
Looking at it again from the public's view, I would like to see that money protected and not used by some rogue council down the line. And I think that's just the smarter way to do it. The money should be set aside for the pensions of the employees.
And I think one of the stronger arguments towards the public and for council members that have not sat on this committee and heard these presentations is just to point to all the other cities and agencies throughout California that have been taking advantage of this in the last few years. Something we talked about a little bit on November 3rd is we're at a point where now almost $5 billion worth of POBs have been issued in California just in the last 12 or so months. It's really gaining popularity and steam amongst cities, particularly in Southern California. And I think demonstrating that to the council and to the public is a really strong argument without having to necessarily dive into all the specific complications that may go over people's head if explained in a short period of time.
Right, and another added factor to make that at least more understandable about why now is the fact that we're coming through a period of historically low interest rates, which are now ending their historic run. And we're starting to see the signs that rates are going to start over the next year or so going to go up, and they could go up substantially, where the opportunity to be able to do this type of refinancing in effect of your unfunded liability will no longer be relevant. That's why if you notice in the policy, we're advocating or suggesting that there be at least a 2 percentage points, 200 basis points difference between the cost of the interest rate you're paying on the bonds and what you are currently paying to CalPERS, which means that you would issue the bonds for 4.8% interest or less. Most likely less. Our estimate is going to be, it will be in the 3% range.
That was my question. Because with things as crazy as they are, what would you expect by the time we get to March, if that's the target date?
Right. Well, I'll tell you, if you'd asked me that question yesterday, I would have given you a different answer, because listening to Chairman Powell today of the Federal Reserve testifying before the Senate, he had a blockbuster statement that they're going to start the tapering faster now. It's the first time he's mentioned that. That's going to have the effect of moving interest rates up a little bit faster than what we had thought. But still, they're going to be within the very attractive range, at least I think, for the next 6 to 9 months. So that's within the time frame of when we'd be able to get a validation suit completed and issue the bonds. So I think we would be somewhere in the 3% range, give or take. On the low side, high 2%. On the upside, medium to high 3%, still creating, if we're looking at the proposed savings where we were around 850,000, I can see that ranging from 600,000 a year to 900,000 a year, something in that range. Still very, very attractive compared to sitting and doing nothing.
Great, thank you. Guys, I'm sorry, I gotta run. I
Yeah,
need to
Julia.
leave
Thank
abruptly. Take care.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Julia.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
All right.
thank you. But I am going to come back to Julia's comment that after she had made her comment, she's going to look at the city staff, city manager and city staff with regard to the direction that we move next. And where is it that you feel that we need to, in which direction?
I think it's good to have a good
Yeah,
policy in place. I am not in favor of issuing POBs. So I'm not really, I'd rather do additional discretionary payments directly to CalPERS. I'm not expert as they are, but like they said, GFOA doesn't recommend issuing POBs. There's a lot of risk. The sample that they showed us looks good in paper, but like Rob said, it changes every year because of all the different assumptions that come into the calculation that PERS does every year. So it's that's my thing. I think it's still a good thing that we have a policy in place and decide, what do we need to do? How are we going to fund this? And
Where the funding will come from for that. Okay.
And one
Please.
question on this, on what you were saying. How do you think, or do we think that it would still be smart, or is it required that we do go ahead with the judicial validation then?
I don't think there's any risk in it.
Because we don't have to, we
Right.
could or don't.
Right,
have to.
the decision to
Okay.
actually proceed is one, and actually there may be something that, as part of that, Bud, is there any additional intelligence that comes as part of judicial review?
I'm sorry, say that again, John.
Does a judicial review provide any additional information that's helpful?
Not only that they validate the fact that it does conform to state law of being able to issue without a vote and all of that. That's the main reason to do the validation. I might want to point out, Maria, that we went to the reason we included in this presentation all of the reasons that the GFOA has stated as to why they do not recommend issuing, and we answered every single one of those from the point of view that a California issued POB does not violate any of the circumstances that they present in their reasoning for not issuing. All of the criticisms that they have, we are avoiding those in the way we would structure the issue.
And that GFOA report from 2015 is referenced a lot at cities and councils that we speak to. And they actually reissued and updated that report for the first time in a couple years, just this year in 2021. And they did not add any significant risks or changes to their outlook of the report, just identifying those specific concerns with POBs that are structured inefficiently that can create issues.
And most of those concerns relate to other states, because they're a national organization, relate to the way other pension obligations bonds are issued in other states, where they try to out-earn the performance of a pension provider separately by trying to not pay their pension obligations to that agency, but to invest in themselves and try to do that. So it's different. Some of the criticisms they have in that report are right on point with the state of Illinois and other states that have those kind of bonds being issued.
I think there's here's the part that is unusual about this, as opposed to issuing water bonds for a project, because you know what the project's going to cost, right? You're going to build something and it's going to cost you $25 million, and you're going to borrow monies to pay it over time. It's known. As I said, on that scale, it's variable. And this kind of tie it back to, I don't know if it's a good analogy or not, you have to tell me, but it's like the mortgages of the recession where they were adjustable rate, right? So you had a mortgage, so you're going to have fixed debt. That's a fixed schedule that you're running against an unknown. You have a projected. Now, do I think CalPERS is going to do better than 23%? No. In fact, the whole reason it went backwards is because they did so well, because the way the policy is written is to assume that there's going to be a flop, because they're not going to make that. In fact, there's an assumption they're going to make significantly less. In fact, there was downward pressure. I guess this gets to the gist of it, which is the uncertainty, because there were pressures at the CalPERS board to move it to 6.5, yes, recognizing they even made 23% last year, because they said, looking at the long horizon, we think that it's even too optimistic to say that you're going to make 6.8. So that gets into then the question, and that's where that 2% becomes a big deal, because what you see is that compaction that's starting to come down is again, there was downward pressure at 6.5. You're going to have some years where they do really well. It's just going to oscillate. It takes discipline. I guess in the end, and this is kind of what I think Maria's saying, it takes discipline. And discipline works two ways, either at the forward end or compelling.
And I want to thank Maria for her comments with regard to that, because I can see in the vision of having that stabilized versus having it fluctuating and not being sure of what's going to come in.
So I started to solve this. Is a political decision, really.
And that's what because this is a newness.
There's a really great saying that I heard from now Vice Chair Perone, which is, when we make decisions in consideration of, is it our grandkids? I can't remember he had a saying.
Could be.
I don't know, that when they make decisions, it's like, what does this look like for the next 100 years? So, and these are kind of you're looking at a schedule for 22 years. Right. And that is going to be, realized debt for 22 years that you're locking into.
And over the last 20 years, CalPERS overall average performance is 5.5%. That includes years where they made 20% and years where they lost 18 and 20%. So we've had a very good market this last year, which is they were able to finally take advantage of. But interest rates start going up like we think they are, you're going to see the stock market not perform the way that it has been over the last couple of years, with all the help from the Federal Reserve, which is now going to be pulled. So that's another thing to look at also.
And I would just add, I would just add, I think you're kind of pinpointing the real risk, John, is important. We've scoured that GFOA report and we just kind of scratch our heads. I think Bud's correct that it does relate more to states outside of California, because point by point in the GFOA outline, every single one of the points, with the exception of one, which is the point of risk, we don't know what CalPERS will earn. So with the exception of that point, the POBs are not structured like GFOA is suggesting. For example, GFOA suggests that POBs cannot be called. And out of the 5 billion of POBs that will have been issued this year, I don't know of any that are issued with the ability to not call the bond. So I think GFOA does have one very valid point, and that is we don't know what CalPERS will earn. So we don't know if we're going to save 850,000 per year or 650,000 per year or 900,000 per year or 400,000 per year. And I think not being able to quantify that is uncomfortable for many agencies. But I do think that that's the one point that GFOA makes that's actually valid as a risk.
Well said.
The compelling, and I hadn't kind of put it together, but it was at the last meeting, which was talking about the 6.8%. You're paying 6.8% on your unfunded. So it's compounding interest, which is why it has that bell-shaped curve effect.
Absolutely. I mean, when you take a look at the total of the payments and see a breakdown on your current amortization schedule with CalPERS of how much goes to interest and how much goes to principal, that shows a very big number. And that's what with these low interest rates, that's what that protects on doing a bond.
I know. Tough call, huh?
Complicated.
Tough call here. What we do know is we want to have a policy. And that's.
So that part we could work on,
Yeah,
and
that's
maybe
what
we schedule another meeting in January where we bring a draft back. And our next
Sure.
council meeting, we're likely not, it's up to the council. We likely won't be having a council meeting on January 4th. So our next one would be the 18th. And maybe we can target then so having a meeting of the audit committee on, second week of January or sometime in some time frame.
Sure.
Before that council meeting.
And by then we might also have better information from CalPERS at the actual effect of the 2021 performance and have a better estimate that we could talk to CalPERS actuary and get a better number for what you actually owe, and also work through the policy.
That would be good. That would be good. So we will go ahead and schedule the next meeting for January. Is that what we're going to do for January? Audit committee or next month's December?
I just know it's going to get very.
It's going to be
get very hectic in the next couple.
What I'm saying. So we want to go dark for the month of December for an audit committee meeting. And the next city council meeting would be when? In January?
Likely January 18th.
The 18th, okay.
And your agenda deadline, if we're bringing anything like the policy to them, would be the 13th, right? The 11th.
Yeah, that we published on the 13th. So
when do we want to meet? I'm looking at that.
Does Martin Luther King throw the agenda deadline or anything off for the city? That's the Monday before the 18th.
not a holiday here.
Okay.
What about that in that first week of January?
Yeah. How about the 5th or 6th? Does that work for? And then that would give a week.
It would always have to be at 4 o'clock. I don't know what Julia would be available.
That's fine.
Thursday would be better for me.
For this next meeting,
if it's January, that first week, because I have some board meetings on the 5th.
Okay. January the 6th.
I think it's the 6th, right? Thursday's the 6th.
Yeah, I'm looking at
Right.
January 6th at 4 o'clock.
If Julia, I don't know what her schedule's gonna be.
I don't, I may be traveling, I may be back sooner. Than that. I'll just,
Let's
I-
go
I'll
ahead
be-
and
I'll-
schedule it, and if we
yeah.
need to.
Okay.
I have a wedding in Arkansas that I'll be coming.
Okay.
Wow, wow.
But we're still determining what are gonna be our flyback date. So,
Okay.
yeah, that's how I'll be sitting here. New Year's Day wedding.
Wow, that's kind of cool.
Yeah. Outdoors, in January in Arkansas. It should
Oh
be
my
great.
gosh.
Should be great.
Okay. Well, we just went into other matters. We just went to scheduling the meeting. I want to say thank you again for all the information. And Rob, thank you for joining us and providing us with your comments, and Nikki and the gentleman Bud and the other Rob over here. I'm looking at the screen.
Absolutely.
It's appreciated. So the next meeting will be January the 6th at 4 p.m. And I don't have a clock. Oh, I'm looking at the one up there. It is now 6:30.
5:30.
5:30? I goes, wait a minute. It is now 5:30. We've been here a long time. We will adjourn the meeting. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to the next meeting.
Okay.
Thank you